The Galactic Council gave a warning, yet they still chose to invade Earth. The alert came at 3 in the morning, and it was not the kind of alert anyone had a protocol for. Every screen on the planet lit up at the same time. Not just televisions and phones. Billboards. Hospital monitors. Airport departure boards. The screens inside submarines running silent beneath the Pacific. The old CRT monitor in the back office of a fish shop in Aberdeen, Scotland, that had not been turned on in 6 years. Every single display surface on Earth showed the same image at once, and it stayed there for exactly 4 minutes. Commander Yara Osei was already awake when it happened. She had been reviewing satellite positioning data in a bunker beneath Geneva, running on her third cup of tea, when the monitor in front of her went white. Then the face appeared. It was not a human face. It was structured like one, vaguely, in the way that a sketch of a face resembles a face without being one. 2 dark horizontal openings where eyes might be. A ridge of pale material along the center, like a nose that had been smoothed flat by someone who had only heard a nose described but never seen one. No visible mouth, yet the voice came through clearly in every language simultaneously, perfectly calibrated to each listener's native tongue. Inhabitants of the third planet of this solar system, the voice said. You have been observed for 2 of your centuries. You have been assessed. This message is delivered as a formality required by Galactic Council Resolution 7, Article 12. You are hereby informed that the Verith Dominion has filed a claim of subjugation over your world. You have 14 of your days to signal compliance. Compliance means the cessation of all orbital military activity, the decommissioning of nuclear devices, and the formal acknowledgement of Verith authority. Non-compliance will result in enforcement. This message will not be repeated. Then the screens went back to whatever they had been showing before. The fish shop monitor went dark again. Yara sat very still for several seconds. Then she picked up the secure line and called General Owen Fletcher at the Coalition Command Center in Brussels. Did you see it? She asked. Everyone on the planet saw it, he said. My grandson called me. He thought it was a movie trailer. She almost laughed. She did not. Yara was 41 years old, and she had spent the last 9 years in the United Nations Earth Defense Coalition, a body that had been created quietly, without public announcement, after a series of deep space anomalies had suggested to certain governments that humanity might not be alone and might not be welcomed. She had been recruited out of the British Army's Intelligence Division, specifically because she was good at staying calm when the information in front of her was genuinely alarming. The information in front of her right now was genuinely alarming. She pulled up the secondary transmission. This was the one that the public never saw, the one that had arrived on encrypted military frequencies 18 seconds after the broadcast, addressed specifically to the Coalition Command Network. It was from a different sender. Not the Verith. Someone called the Arbiter Thesivane, representing the Galactic Council itself. The transmission was a video file. 42 minutes long. It showed the fall of 23 worlds. Yara watched all of it. She did not look away. She watched species she had no names for attempt to defend their planets with technologies that looked, from Earth's perspective, extraordinarily advanced. She watched those defenses fail in hours. She watched the Verith land. She watched what came after the landing, and she kept her expression steady even when her hands were not. When the file ended, a text block appeared. It was from Thesivane directly. I am sending this in violation of Standard Council Protocol, it read. I am not permitted to advise you. I am permitted only to observe and record. However, I am also bound by personal conscience, which the Council has not yet found a way to legislate. The Verith have never failed to break a world. Their record is not a coincidence. It is a system. They have studied your species for 200 years and they believe you will behave as every other species has behaved. They expect confusion, then fear, then division, then collapse. They have scheduled your subjugation for completion within 72 of your hours. I am sending this because I believe you deserve to know what is coming. What you do with that knowledge is your own affair. The message ended there. Yara forwarded it to Fletcher and then sat back and looked at the ceiling for exactly 30 seconds. That was how long she allowed herself. Then she started making calls. The next 14 days were the loudest and most chaotic 2 weeks in recorded human history. The public broadcast had, as expected, produced every possible reaction simultaneously. There were people who believed it was a hoax engineered by governments. There were people who believed it was divine judgment. There were people who formed community groups to prepare welcome ceremonies. There were governments that issued statements of defiance before their foreign ministers had even finished reading the text of the message. There were governments that began quiet, private communications suggesting they might be open to the concept of compliance. The coalition moved during the noise. Yara had learned, through years of observing human behavior under pressure, that the best time to do difficult things was when everyone was distracted by the argument about whether the difficult thing needed to be done. 3 things happened in those 14 days that the public did not know about. The first was a global emergency deployment of every piece of military hardware that had been quietly developed and stored under the coalition's research program. Most of it had never been publicly disclosed. Some of it had never been tested outside of controlled environments. Yara signed off on the deployment orders herself, knowing that if this went wrong, there would be no one left to hold her accountable and no world left to be accountable to. The second was the activation of a communication device that the Coalition's Science Division had built from theoretical specifications reverse-engineered from the anomaly signals detected over the previous decade. They broadcast on the frequency the Arbiter had used in its private transmission. They were not sure anyone would answer. The Arbiter answered within 6 hours. The conversation was brief and careful. Yara spoke. Thesivane listened. She asked one thing and one thing only. Is there anything about us that surprised you? Anything in your 200 years of observation that you did not expect? The Arbiter was quiet for a long moment. Yes, it said finally. You did not stop. Every other species we observed at your technological level reduced its internal conflicts when faced with an external threat. You did not reduce yours. You maintained them. And somehow, through the maintenance of internal conflict, you continued to develop. We have no model for that. The Verith have no model for that. Good, Yara said. The third thing that happened in those 14 days was the official global response. 31 national governments, operating under the coalition framework, issued a unified statement. It was translated into every known language and broadcast on every frequency available to Earth's communication infrastructure. It was also sent directly to the Verith on the frequency they had used for their initial broadcast. The statement was 4 sentences long. We have received your message. We have reviewed your terms. We have considered the consequences of noncompliance as you have described them. Our answer is no. Yara was standing in the main operations center when the transmission finished sending. The room was full of people who had not slept properly in 2 weeks, who had families they were trying not to think about, who understood exactly what that 4-sentence statement had just set in motion. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then a young signals officer named Callum, who had graduated from his training program 8 months ago and still wrote letters to his mother every Sunday, let out a long slow breath and said, "Well, that's that, then." A few people laughed. Not many. But enough. The Veritha's response came 11 hours later. It was a single word, transmitted on every frequency they had used before. It had no direct translation in any Earth language, but the Arbiter's private follow-up message translated it as something close to the concept of a sentence being carried out. Not a threat. Not even anger. Just confirmation. They were coming. Yara went back to her desk, poured the last of the tea, and looked at the deployment map on the screen in front of her. 72 orbital platforms. 14,000 ground units. 6 years of preparation that had been accelerated into 14 days. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But she also knew something that the Verith, with their 200 years of careful observation, had somehow managed to miss. She knew it because she had lived it, because she had watched it every day of her career and every year of her life before that. Humans were not at their best when they were safe. They were at their best when there was absolutely no good option left and someone had to find one anyway. She folded her hands on the desk and waited for the war to begin. Owen Fletcher called her at 3:12 in the morning, 7 days after the response transmission had gone out. "They're here," he said. 72 vessels confirmed in low orbit. First sensor reads are coming in now. Yara was already dressed. She had barely left the operations center in 3 days. She pulled up the orbital display and looked at the cluster of signatures appearing on the far side of the planet's shadow, moving in a slow, deliberate arc that would bring them into full orbital positioning within 4 hours. They were enormous. That was the first thing that hit her, not intellectually but physically, somewhere deep in the chest where logic did not reach. She had seen the specifications from prior intercepted sensor data. She had run the numbers. But seeing the actual returns on the screen was different from knowing the numbers. Each vessel registered as roughly 3 kilometers in length. 72 of them. Moving in perfect formation, in absolute silence, and they had crossed the distance between whatever star system they had come from in Earth's orbit without anyone detecting them until they were already there. Formation analysis, she said. Lieutenant Priya Nair, her lead tactical analyst, was already on it. Wedge formation, standard orbital suppression doctrine based on what we've seen in the archive footage. They'll spread to cover 3 primary target zones before initiating bombardment. Estimated first strike window opens in 4 hours, 22 minutes. Confirmed targets. Military installations, power infrastructure, communication nodes. Same playbook they used on the other worlds. Yara nodded slowly. Good. Priya looked up from her console. Commander, did you just say good? They're running their standard playbook, Yara said. That means they're confident. Confident opponents make assumptions. Assumptions are gaps. She turned to the room. 43 people, all watching her. She did not give a speech. She had never been a speech person. She just said, execute Plan Meridian. All stations to readiness. We've known this was coming. Let's do what we prepared for. The room moved. Plan Meridian was 6 years in the making, condensed and accelerated in the final 14 days. Its core logic was simple, though its execution was extraordinarily complex. Every military installation that existed in any publicly available database, any installation that could be found through satellite imagery or signals intelligence, had been stripped of all real equipment and personnel over the previous 8 months and replaced with decoys. Structural shells with heat signatures, power draws, and electronic emissions that matched the real thing exactly. The real assets were somewhere else entirely. The power grid that the Verith expected to cripple was a ghost. The real grid had been rebuilt underground and distributed across 17,000 nodes, each one small enough to be individually insignificant and collectively impossible to neutralize without destroying every square kilometer of the planet's surface. The communications network they expected to sever ran through repurposed mining tunnels, deep ocean cables laid by submarine in the final weeks, and a constellation of low-profile microsatellites that looked, to any sensor system, like orbital debris. The Verith bombardment began at 4:41 GMT. It was precise. Yara had to acknowledge that. They hit every target they had identified with remarkable accuracy, and from a strategic standpoint, if those targets had been real, it would have been an effective opening move. The operational centers of a dozen national militaries reduced to rubble in under an hour. Power stations going dark across 3 continents. Communication towers falling. In the operations center beneath Geneva, every screen stayed on. Every channel stayed open. The distributed grid held without a flicker. Priya was tracking the impact data. All decoy sites confirmed destroyed. 0 real assets lost. Real grid at 100%. All command networks nominal. Yara exhaled. Now they land. The first Verith landing forces came down in 3 zones. One in central Brazil, approximately 60 kilometers north of the city of Cuiabá. One in the Siberian lowlands east of the Ob River. One in southern Nigeria, near the Benue Valley. Classic territorial anchor strategy. Establish 3 separated ground positions simultaneously to force defenders to divide their response. The Verith soldiers who stepped out of those landing craft were exactly as described in the archive data. Approximately 2 meters tall in their combat exoskeletons, which provided protection against most conventional anti-armor munitions, high heat resistance, and a Neuralink communications system that allowed their command structure to communicate with individual units in real time. Their weapons were energy-based, with a charge rate that allowed for sustained fire well beyond what any human infantry unit could match. On paper, each Verith soldier was worth roughly 30 human soldiers in a straight conventional engagement. The engagement at Cuiabá was not conventional. The first column moved north along what had been mapped as a primary access route. Coalition forces had been repositioned there 10 days earlier, not in visible fortifications but dug into the landscape itself, using camouflage systems that had been specifically developed to defeat the Veritha's sensor frequencies. The Verith column did not detect them until the engagement was already underway. But that was only the first layer. The weapons that the Coalition used in that first engagement had been designed specifically against Verith shield harmonics. The shield technology the Verith used operated on a specific frequency band that made it extraordinarily effective against most known energy and kinetic weapons. The Coalition's research division had spent 3 years analyzing the anomaly signals and the data from the Arbiter's archive footage, working backwards from observed shield behavior to deduce the operating frequencies. The result was a modified particle burst projector that hit the Verith shields at a resonance frequency that destabilized rather than deflected. It did not punch through the shields so much as it made the shields briefly incoherent, opening a narrow window for conventional kinetic follow-up. It worked. Not perfectly. Not cleanly. The Verith adapted faster than any of the models had predicted, pulling back and reorganizing within 20 minutes of first contact. 3 Coalition units were lost in the initial exchange. Yara watched the data come in and felt each loss like a physical weight, because she knew every number on that screen was a person who had gotten up that morning knowing this might happen and shown up anyway. But the Verith column had been stopped. In the first engagement of the first invasion in human history, the column had been stopped. The Siberian contact came in 20 minutes later. Harder. The terrain was more open and the Verith adapted their formation based on what had just happened in Brazil. They sent in a wider spread, lower density formation designed to make the resonance weapons less effective by reducing the shield overlap zones. Coalition Commander Nathan Bright, running the Siberian response from a mobile command unit near Tumen, had anticipated exactly this and already reconfigured his deployment accordingly. The two forces engaged across 40 kilometers of frozen ground, and the fight went on for 11 hours, and at the end of it the Verith had advanced less than 6 kilometers from their landing point. In Nigeria, the engagement was faster and more decisive, partly because the Coalition had prepositioned its heaviest resonance units there and partly because a 19-year-old signals specialist named Grace, working from a relay station near Makurdi, identified a pattern in the Verith neural link communication traffic that allowed her team to predict the timing of their unit repositioning commands. That information was transmitted up the chain in real time, and Coalition forces were moving to counterpositions before the Verith units had finished receiving their own orders. The Verith lost contact with 2 of their forward units entirely for a period of 40 minutes due to a localized signal disruption that Grace's team generated. For 40 minutes, those units were operating without command coordination, and Coalition forces used every one of those minutes. By nightfall on the first day of the ground war, the Verith had 3 landing points, none of which they controlled beyond a radius of 10 kilometers. They had taken losses that their own command structure had categorized, according to intercepted traffic, as statistically impossible for a Class F primitive engagement. Yara stood in the operations center looking at the map and let herself feel, for just a moment, something that was not quite hope but was in the same neighborhood. Then she looked at her own losses. She looked at each unit designation that had gone to non-operational status. She read the numbers and she held them in her mind and did not let herself set them aside, because setting them aside was how you started making decisions that treated people like pieces on a board. She thought about what Thesavane had said. About how the Verith expected confusion, fear, division, and collapse. Instead, on the first day of the first alien invasion in human history, they had gotten a 19-year-old signal specialist who had figured out how to predict enemy orders in real time, and 11 hours of ground combat in Siberia that ended with the enemy 6 kilometers from where they started. She turned to Callum at the signals desk. "Get me a channel to every active unit," she said. "I want them to hear this directly." He set it up. She picked up the handset. "This is Commander Osei," she said. "Day 1 is done. You held. Every position held. That has never happened before on any world these people have ever touched. It's happened here because you prepared and you held and you kept thinking when everything was designed to make you stop thinking. Get rest where you can. Tomorrow they recalibrate. So do we. Osei out." She set down the handset. Priya was looking at her from across the room. "Do you think they actually will recalibrate?" "Absolutely," Yara said. "They're very good. They've done this 23 times. So what do we do? Yara looked at the map. At the 3 small red clusters of alien ground forces sitting in the landscape of her planet, surrounded by the blue markers of everything humanity had prepared. She thought about the archive footage. She thought about the 23 worlds that had not had 6 years to prepare, had not known what was coming, had not had a 19-year-old named Grace at a relay station in Makurdi seeing patterns in an enemy's communication traffic. We do what we always do, she said. We learn faster than they do. She pulled up her chair, opened the tactical report from all 3 engagement zones, and got to work. 2 weeks into the ground war, the Verith changed everything. They pulled back all 3 landing columns to their original insertion points and did not advance for 36 hours. No bombardment. No probing contact. Nothing. Just silence from 3 clusters of alien forces sitting inside their defensive perimeters, and the quiet, low hum of 72 warships overhead maintaining orbital positions. Yara had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 2 weeks. She sat across from Nathan Bright, who had flown in from Siberia for the strategy session, and looked at the stillness on the tactical map. They're learning, Nathan said. He was 48, a former Royal Marines officer with close-cropped gray hair and the particular kind of calm that came from having been in enough serious situations to stop performing calmness and simply have it. Everything we did in week 1, they've catalogued. They're rebuilding their engagement model. That's what I would do, Yara said. So would I. The question is what they're building toward. They haven't used their orbital strike capacity to its full extent yet, said Dr. Lena Marsh from the Coalition Science Division. Lena was the person who had led the team that cracked the shield frequency problem, and Yara had learned to pay close attention when she spoke. The bombardment on day 1 was targeted. Surgical. They could have hit population centers and they didn't. That's consistent with the archive footage, Yara said. The Verith don't destroy what they're claiming. They want the world intact. Subjugation, not elimination. So that's our ceiling, Nathan said. They won't go beyond a certain threshold of destruction because it defeats the purpose. That's a constraint we can use, Lena said. It limits their options. Yara nodded. It does. But it doesn't mean they won't push right up to that ceiling. The 36 hours of silence ended with a very different kind of offensive than the first week's engagements. The Verith pushed out from all 3 positions simultaneously, but not in columns. In wide, dispersed nets. Low-density, high-mobility formations designed specifically to neutralize the resonance weapon advantage by spreading targets beyond effective coverage area. They had learned. Yara had known they would learn. The question was always whether humanity could learn faster. The answer to that question arrived from an unexpected direction. On the 3rd day of the new Verith offensive, a 17-year-old student named Aaron, living in Pune, India, uploaded an open-source software package to the Global Defense Network. He had written it in 11 days, working from publicly available data on Verith flight movement patterns that coalition forces had been recording since the first day of the invasion. The software allowed any surface-to-air defense battery, anywhere on the planet, to automatically calculate optimal firing solutions against dispersed Verith aerial formations in real time, without requiring a trained targeting specialist to operate it. He had posted a description of what it did to the coalition's civilian contribution platform with a note that said, "I think this might help. Let me know if there's anything wrong with the code." There was nothing wrong with the code. Within 48 hours, the software had been adapted, improved upon, and integrated into defense networks on 4 continents by a distributed network of developers, engineers, and enthusiasts who had never met each other and were coordinating entirely through the global communication infrastructure that the Verith had tried and failed to sever on day 1. By the end of the week, the Verith's aerial support, which had been providing critical cover for the dispersed ground formations, was taking losses at a rate that forced a partial withdrawal to higher altitudes. Without low-altitude aerial support, the dispersed ground formations became vulnerable. Coalition forces, running on the updated software, hit them across all 3 zones in coordinated pushes. The Verith fell back again. But they did not stop. That was the thing Yara had to keep reminding her command staff of, because there was a temptation, after each successful defensive action, to feel that momentum had shifted decisively. It had not. The Verith were adapting to every response within days. They were not a force that gave up. They were a force that recalibrated and returned with modifications. What nobody had modeled, what the Verith command structure did not appear to have any doctrine for, was what happened when both sides were adapting at the same speed but one side had a fundamental structural advantage in the adaptation process. Humanity's adaptation was not centralized. It could not be stopped by targeting a command node or disrupting a chain of communication. It was happening in relay stations in Makurdi and university computer labs in Pune and coalition research facilities in 100 different locations, and even if you destroyed all of those, it was happening in the conversations between soldiers at the front who were seeing the same enemy behavior and working out counters between themselves and radioing those counters up and down the chain in real time. The Verith had a command structure. A very good one. Orders came down from above, were executed below, and were reported back up. It was efficient and precise, and it had worked on 23 worlds. On this world, every person in the fight was also a source of tactical innovation. Every unit that made contact was simultaneously fighting and generating data that fed back into a collective understanding of the enemy that grew faster than any centralized structure could generate. 2 breakthroughs came in week 5 that changed the operational picture entirely. The first came from the Coalition's biological research team, led by Dr. Rachel Ward and a group of international specialists who had spent 3 years studying everything known about Verith physiology from archive materials. They developed an aerosol compound that disrupted the Neuralink communication signal within a localized area without causing any lasting physical harm to the Verith soldiers exposed to it. It did not hurt them. It simply made it impossible for them to receive or transmit orders through their command network for a period of approximately 40 minutes after exposure. 40 minutes without centralized command coordination, as the engagement in Nigeria had already demonstrated, was a very long time. The second breakthrough came from a quiet, methodical engineer named Felix, who had been working in a coalition materials lab in Montreal on a modification to existing kinetic munitions that would allow them to maintain terminal effectiveness against Verith exoskeletal armor without requiring the resonance effect as a precondition. The modification involved a specific delivery geometry that he had derived from careful analysis of armor recovery data gathered at the Quyaba engagement. It took him 4 weeks to get right, and when he presented the working version to the coalition command, he apologized for taking so long. Nobody told him that 4 weeks to solve a problem that the collective defense establishments of every prior species had never solved at all was not slow. By the end of week 7, the Verith ground war had stalled. All 3 occupation zones were contracting rather than expanding. Verith losses were at a level that, based on the archive footage Thesivane had provided, had simply never been recorded in a Class F world engagement before. And then something happened that Yara had not seen in the battle models. She received an intercepted Verith command transmission, translated by the Coalition's cryptography team. It was a communication between Verith ground commanders and the fleet overhead. It said, approximately, "The enemy appears to find this situation stimulating." She read it twice. She set it down. She walked to the window of the operations center, which looked out over a courtyard that was cold and gray in the November air, and she thought about what that transmission actually meant. The Verith had spent 200 years studying humanity. They had observed human wars, human disasters, human recoveries. They had watched humans do extraordinarily difficult things under extraordinarily difficult conditions. And somehow, across all of that observation, they had not managed to identify the single most important thing about the species they were planning to subjugate. That the difficult situation was not the obstacle. For humans, the difficult situation was frequently the point. The private channel opened at 0817 on a Thursday morning in the 7th week of the war. Yara was in the middle of reviewing updated deployment positions for the Nigerian front when the signal alert appeared on her secondary screen. Quantum link. Council encrypted. Sender identification, Arbiter Thesivane. She closed the deployment files and accepted the connection. Commander Osei. The Arbiter's voice came through clearly, the same voice she had heard in the initial transmission 7 weeks ago, though something in the quality of it seemed different now. Quieter, perhaps. More careful. "I am contacting you in violation of my observational mandate for the 2nd time in this engagement. I want you to know that I am aware of the consequences for my standing within the Council." "Why are you risking it?" Yara asked. "Because the situation has reached a point where my silence would itself constitute a choice," the Arbiter said. "And I prefer to make my choices deliberately." Yara set down her pen. "What situation?" The Verith have filed a formal request with the Council for authorization to escalate their engagement protocols beyond current parameters, the Arbiter said. They are requesting permission to use what is classified in Council terminology as a wide-area suppression event. The practical meaning of that classification, in this context, would be a strike pattern capable of rendering large portions of your planet's surface uninhabitable. The room felt very still. Yara was aware of every small sound. The ventilation hum. The faint tapping of Priya's fingers on a keyboard somewhere behind her. They would destroy what they're claiming, she said. That defeats their own purpose. Their purpose has shifted, the Arbiter said. A world that submits is an asset. A world that demonstrates this level of resistance is now, within Verith strategic thinking, a liability. They are no longer seeking to claim your world. They are seeking to neutralize it as an example. How long before the Council rules on the request? The standard deliberation period is 14 days. However, the Council has never previously been asked to rule on this type of request against a Class F world. There is no precedent. The deliberation may take longer. And what is the Council likely to decide? Thesivane was quiet for a moment, and in that pause, Yara heard something that she had not expected. Discomfort. The Council has rules, the Arbiter said carefully. Resolution 7 grants the Verith subjugation rights over any unclaimed world that does not comply with terms within the required window. Your world did not comply. Under strict reading of Resolution 7, the Verith have authority to pursue compliance through escalated means, within the Council's authorization framework. So the Council might authorize it. The Council might, the Arbiter said. Unless it has reason to reconsider the framework. Yara was very quiet for a moment. She was looking at the wall in front of her, where a tactical map was pinned, covered in the markings of 7 weeks of an impossible defense. She was thinking about the 23 worlds in the archive footage. She was thinking about what kind of council had watched all of that happen and continued to operate within a framework that allowed it. What kind of reason would cause the council to reconsider the framework, she asked. The framework was built on an assumption, the Arbiter said. The assumption is that a Class F world, encountering the Verith, has 2 possible outcomes. Subjugation or elimination. Your world has produced a third outcome. Not victory, not yet, but resistance sustained beyond any recorded precedent for this classification level. That third outcome exists outside the framework. The Council does not have rules for a world that should not have been able to do what your world is doing. You're saying the rules don't cover us. I am saying that if the rules do not cover your situation, then the authorization the Verith are seeking may not be valid under those same rules. That is a legal argument that several Council members would be obligated to examine. The examination would take time. Time during which the escalation authorization would be on hold. Yara felt something shift in her understanding of what this conversation was. You're telling me how to buy time. I am making observations, the Arbiter said. I am an observational entity. It is what I do. What would this legal argument require? Evidence of the third outcome. Documented evidence, formally submitted to the Council record, demonstrating that your world's resistance has produced a situation that falls outside the existing classification framework. Such evidence, submitted by a Council member in good standing, would obligate the full Council to review before acting. Are you a Council member in good standing? The pause that followed was very long. I have been a Council member for 417 of your years, the Arbiter said. My standing has never previously been questioned. Whether it survives a second violation of my observational mandate in 8 weeks remains to be seen. You would submit the evidence. If the evidence were provided to me in the correct format, I would have an obligation to enter it into the Council record. Once entered, it cannot be withdrawn. The review process would be mandatory. Yara pulled a notepad toward her. Old habit. She had always thought better when she was writing things down. What format do they need? I will send you the specifications, the Arbiter said. Commander, I need you to understand something before I do. I am not operating from a position of certainty. I believe this will buy time. I believe the legal review will find the framework inadequate. I believe a number of Council members who have had private concerns about Verith activities for many years will find in this situation an opportunity to raise those concerns formally. But I am not certain. The Council is an old institution with old habits, and old institutions do not always move in the direction that logic suggests. I understand, Yara said. I also want to be clear that buying time is not the same as winning, the Arbiter said. Even if the Council halts the escalation authorization, the Verith forces in your orbit and on your surface remain. The ground engagement continues. The situation does not resolve through this legal mechanism. It only prevents a specific escalation. I understand that too, Yara said. Another pause. When the Arbiter spoke again, the quality of its voice had shifted slightly in a way Yara could not quite name. I have processed the surrender of 41 worlds in my career, it said. I have delivered the terms. I have watched the responses. I have filed the records. In 417 years, I have never submitted evidence to the Council on behalf of a world under engagement. Another pause. I want to be accurate about what I am doing. I am not submitting evidence on your behalf because I believe you will win. I am submitting it because I believe it is correct to submit it. Because what is happening on your planet is genuinely without precedent, and precedent-setting events deserve to be in the record. That is all. Yara looked at the notepad in front of her. She had written 3 words. She looked at them for a moment. Thessavane, she said. Yes. What happens if we win? Not the legal review. If we actually push the Verith out. The Arbiter did not answer immediately. When it did, the voice carried something that Yara could not name in any language she knew, some quality that existed at the edge of what its non-human voice could carry. Then everything changes, it said. For all of us. The channel closed. Yara sat for a long moment. Then she turned around and looked at the room. Priya was watching her. Callum was watching her. A dozen other people who had been sitting at their stations, carefully pretending not to listen, were watching her. I need the senior science team in here in 1 hour, she said. And someone find Nathan and get him on a secure line. We have a new objective. What objective? Priya asked. Yara looked at the tactical map on the wall. We're going to put together the most well-documented record of an impossible defense that any civilization in this galaxy has ever seen, she said. And then we're going to send it to the people who make the rules. And they're going to have to decide whether their rules still make sense. She picked up the pen. Let's get to work. The Verith fleet broke orbit on a Tuesday. Yara watched it happen on the orbital tracking display, standing in the operations center with Nathan at her side and Lena Marsh and half the senior command staff behind them, all of them looking at the same thing. 72 signatures, moving. Not repositioning. Not shifting formation. Moving, in the specific geometric pattern that the archive data identified as a controlled withdrawal under ceasefire terms. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Callum, at his signals desk, said quietly, Council ceasefire confirmation just came through on the secure channel. Verith Command has acknowledged terms. Yara exhaled slowly. It had taken 6 more weeks after Thessavane submitted the evidence to the Council. 6 more weeks of ground engagement, of adaptation and counter-adaptation, of losses that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. The Council's legal review had moved slowly at first, then faster as 3 senior Council members, the ones the Arbiter had described as having long-standing private concerns, formally challenged the framework. The Verith escalation request had been suspended pending review. The review had expanded into something far larger than any single authorization request. It had become, according to Thessavane's carefully worded transmissions, a comprehensive examination of how the Verith Dominion had been operating within Council rules for the past 3 centuries. On the ground, the war had continued. The Coalition had pushed. The Verith had pushed back. There had been a terrible week in Week 10, the worst week of the entire engagement, when the Verith changed strategy again and attempted a concentrated breakthrough at a single point near the Siberian landing zone that nearly succeeded. Nathan had been in the field for that one personally. He had come back 2 days later with a new scar along his left forearm and a quietness about him that he had not quite recovered from since. The breakthrough had not succeeded. 2 days before the ceasefire authorization came through, the Verith ground forces had begun pulling back to their landing zones independently of any formal order from above. Yara had watched it happen on the tactical map and had understood what it meant before anyone confirmed it. An army that pulls back without being ordered to is an army that has made an internal decision. They had looked at what was in front of them and made a calculation. The calculation was, this is not going to end in a way we planned for. The ceasefire terms were negotiated through the Council. The Verith were withdrawing. Their ground forces were returning to their vessels. The vessels were leaving. In exchange, Earth was not pursuing the withdrawing forces or attempting to strike departing ships. Clean withdrawal. The coalition had agreed to those terms, and Yara had agreed with the decision, because the point had never been to eliminate the Verith. The point had been to still be here. They were still here. The cost was a number she had been carrying in her mind for weeks, updating it every day, never letting herself stop looking at it clearly. The exact figure, across all theaters and all 12 weeks of engagement, was something she would not discuss publicly for a long time, because the living deserved to have their grief without it being abstracted into a statistic. Every number had been a name. Every name had been a person who had gotten up one morning and decided that showing up was the right thing to do. She thought about Grace at the relay station in Makurdi, who had gone home to her family when the Nigerian front pulled back and had sent Yara a single message that said, "We did it." She thought about Aaron in Pune, who had gone back to his studies and had apparently already started working on a second software package, this one designed to help analyze orbital traffic patterns for early warning of future incursions. She thought about Felix in Montreal, who had submitted a formal apology to the Coalition Command last week for the structural weakness in the early version of his munitions modification that had caused 2 units to experience delivery failures in Week 8, and who Yara had called personally to explain, clearly and directly, that she did not accept the apology because there was nothing to apologize for. She thought about Nathan beside her, watching the fleet's signatures move, and the quietness that sat around him now like a second coat. She thought about all of the people she would never call. The last Verith ship cleared Earth's orbital sphere at 1847 GMT. The room did not erupt. Nobody shouted. There was no dramatic moment. People sat at their stations or stood where they were and looked at the tracking display, and a few people pressed their hands over their mouths, and a few people closed their eyes, and Priya was crying silently at her console without any attempt to hide it, and Yara let her. Callum turned around from his signals desk. His eyes were red. "Commander," he said. "There's a priority transmission coming in. Council frequency. It's the Arbiter." Yara walked to the communications station and took the handset. "Thesivane," she said. "Commander Osei." The Arbiter's voice was its usual precise, measured quality, but beneath it was something Yara had never heard from it before. Something that in a human voice she would have called exhaustion, or perhaps relief, or perhaps both at once. "The Verith withdrawal is complete and confirmed. The ceasefire is in effect. The Council's legal review of the Verith Dominion's operational framework is ongoing and is expected to take, at minimum, the next 18 of your months." "What happens to them at the end of that review?" Yara asked. "That is a matter for the Council to determine," the Arbiter said. "I will say only that the review has uncovered a significant number of additional matters beyond those raised by your engagement. The Dominion's relationship with the Council is going to look different when the review concludes than it did before. And Earth." A pause. "There will be a formal Council session," the Arbiter said. "In approximately 30 of your days. The session will include a vote on the question of Earth's classification. Your current designation is Class F, Primitive World, non-member. There is a motion on the floor to reclassify. To what? That is what the session will determine." Another pause. "I will tell you privately that the motion has support from a larger number of Council members than any motion regarding a single non-member world has received in my 400 years of service. I will tell you also that 3 of those members asked me directly what it was like to talk to you, and I told them it was like talking to someone who had run out of fear and decided to use the space for something else." Yara looked at the empty tracking display. The clean, uncluttered orbital picture of a planet with no foreign ships in its sky. "Will you be at the session?" she asked. "I would not miss it," the Arbiter said. "I am also aware that my attendance will mark the first time in Council history that an Arbiter under formal review for conduct violations has attended a session that their own conduct helped bring about. The Council has expressed this as irregular. Is that a problem?" "I have been informed that it is unprecedented," the Arbiter said. "I have been in this role long enough to view precedents as suggestions." Yara almost smiled. "Thesivane. For what it's worth. What you did mattered. The arbiter was quiet for a moment. What you did mattered more, it said. I submitted documents. You held a planet. The channel closed. Yara set down the handset. She turned to face the room. The room was full of people who were exhausted and grieving and relieved and proud and frightened about what came next and grateful to be standing there at all, and she felt all of those things too, and she did not try to organize them into something that would fit neatly into a sentence. She looked at Nathan. He looked back at her. He nodded, once, and that was enough. All right, she said to the room. Stand down from active engagement protocols. Everyone get some rest. Real rest. Not the kind where you keep one eye on the alerts. She walked back to her station. She sat down. She opened a blank document on the terminal in front of her and looked at it for a moment, thinking about the report she was going to have to write. The complete account, start to finish, for the record. For whatever court or council or historical archive eventually wanted to understand what had happened here. She thought about where to begin. She decided to start with the fish shop monitor in Aberdeen. The one that had not been turned on in 6 years and had lit up anyway, because the signal had reached everything, and no one had been excluded from the moment when the question was asked. That was where it had started. With a question asked to every human being on the planet at once. And the planet had answered. She began to type. 30 days later, Yara sat in a chamber that was not built for human bodies, in a chair that had been specifically fabricated for her by a species whose name she could not pronounce, surrounded by beings who looked nothing like her and represented civilizations that had been traveling between stars since before humanity had figured out how to write things down. The chamber was full. The arbiter had told her privately that the session had drawn the largest attendance in 200 years. She had tried not to let that feel like pressure. She had not entirely succeeded. The vote was not close. She sat in the chamber when the result came through, and she thought about a bunker beneath Geneva, and a signals officer named Callum who wrote letters to his mother every Sunday. She thought about Grace and Aaron and Felix and Nathan. She thought about the people she had never known and would never know who had held positions she would never see and made decisions she would never learn about and had not come home. The arbiter stood at the chamber's central position and formally announced the reclassification in the council's official language, which the translation system rendered into English in her earpiece as follows. Earth. Reclassified from Class F, Primitive World, non-member, to full council member, first contact ratified by engagement record, standing provisional pending integration review. Someone in the chamber, from some species somewhere in the galaxy, made a sound that the translation system identified as the nearest equivalent to applause that their biology allowed. Then others joined in. Not all of them. But more than Yara had expected. She sat very still and let the sound exist around her. Later, walking out of the chamber through a corridor designed for beings much taller than her, the arbiter fell into step beside her. Walking beside it, she was struck again by how strange and how ordinary it seemed at the same time. This entity that had lived 400 years, that had watched 41 worlds stop existing as independent things, that had decided, twice, to violate its own professional mandate because conscience turned out to be harder to legislate than the council had anticipated. How does it feel? The arbiter asked. Yara thought about it honestly. Complicated, she said. Yes, the arbiter said. It usually does. They walked a few more steps in silence. What comes next? Yara asked. Practically. What does council membership actually mean for a world that is still rebuilding? It means you have a seat at the table where decisions are made, the arbiter said. It means other council members have obligations toward you that they did not have before. It means the Verith cannot move against you without council authorization, which is an authorization they are presently in no position to seek. It means you have access to contact, to exchange, to the accumulated record of every civilization that has been a part of this body. A pause. It also means you will be asked for things. Opinions. Votes. Presence on committees. The council has a great deal of committees. That sounds manageable, Yara said. You may revise that assessment after your first committee meeting, the arbiter said. She did smile then. She could not help it. Thesivane, she said. The review. Your review. How is it going? The Council has determined that my actions constituted a violation of the observational mandate, the Arbiter said. They have also determined that the outcome of those actions was, in their assessment, beneficial to the stability of the Council framework. They are currently debating whether a violation that produces beneficial outcomes constitutes a violation in the full sense of the term. What do you think? I think I violated the mandate, the Arbiter said. I think it was correct to do so. I think those two things can both be true simultaneously and that the discomfort of holding both at once is not a problem to be resolved but a condition to be lived with. That's a very human way of thinking, Yara said. Another pause. Perhaps, the Arbiter said. I have been in contact with your species for some months now. It is possible something has transferred. They reached the end of the corridor, and the way forward opened into a wide space filled with soft light and the low sound of many different kinds of being going about the business of an old civilization that had just been surprised by a young one. Yara stopped and stood in that space for a moment and looked at it all. She thought about everything it had cost to be standing here. She thought about the planet behind her, 12 weeks of scars and the long work of healing that did not end just because the fighting did. She thought about the families who had lost people, about the cities that were rebuilding, about Aaron's second software package and Felix's next modification and Grace who had gone home and Nathan with his quiet eyes. She thought about the fish shop monitor in Aberdeen. She thought about the 4-sentence answer that had started all of this. No. Simple and direct and final. The word that had looked like stubbornness to everyone watching and had been, in the deepest part of it, something else entirely. Not refusal. Not pride. Not even courage, exactly. Just the fundamental, baseline, unremarkable human certainty that if there was a way through, someone would find it. That if the situation was hard enough, someone would get interested. That if you pushed people into a corner with no good options, they would start inventing options, and they would do it faster and stranger and more effectively than any 200-year observation program could have prepared anyone for. The Verith had studied humanity for 200 years and had not found that thing. They had seen the wars, the disasters, the recoveries, the stubbornness, the noise. They had not found the thing underneath all of that, the thing that the noise was covering and protecting and expressing simultaneously. The thing that had no name in any language she knew, that lived somewhere between determination and creativity and the total absence of the concept of a fixed limit. She had spent 12 weeks watching it operate in real time, and she still could not name it cleanly. But she could point at the result. The result was that she was standing in a hall of civilizations that had existed for thousands of years, representing a species that had existed for a geologically brief and chaotically eventful time, having just done something that no species at this stage of development had ever done before. And in 30 minutes she had her first Council Committee meeting, which the Arbiter had quietly told her was about deep space territorial boundary definitions and was expected to last 4 hours. She straightened her jacket. She adjusted the small coalition pin on her lapel. She looked at the Arbiter. "Which way is the committee room?" she asked. The Arbiter gestured. She followed. Behind her, through the corridor and across the distance of space, a planet was rebuilding itself. Slowly, imperfectly, the way it had always rebuilt itself, with noise and argument and grief and the particular human insistence on continuing. Ahead of her, a door opened into a room full of beings who were about to discover what it meant to share a table with a species that had decided, quite firmly, that it was staying. Yara walked in and took her seat.